Okay,
All right.
got a few mandatory things here they wanted me to cover first. So today is December 13th, 2022. My name is Seth Tupper, and we're recording an oral history interview for the South Dakota State Historical Society. And we are recording, which is okay with you, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. If we could start by having you state your full name and spell it for us.
Larry Dahlstrom, Larrydahlstrom.
And where and when were you born?
I was born January 15, 1932 in Pettibone, North Dakota.
Pettibone, North Dakota.
Yes.
Okay. Were you a farm kid, or what was your upbringing?
My dad and my mother both were from homesteads in that area. Their parents had homesteaded. I was never a farm kid because my dad was a truck driver, and we moved out of there fairly early into Minnesota, where I grew up. But I always went back to the farms in North Dakota, so I felt like I'm half a farm boy.
Okay.
Yeah.
What brought you to Minnesota then?
My dad's work. We went. He drove for a gas transport company out of Moorhead, Minnesota, and then they moved him to Appleton, Minnesota, as a halfway point between where they loaded gas and where they unloaded, and we lived in Appleton all my growing up years.
Okay.
Appleton is about 90 miles east of Watertown.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you grew up there, graduated high school?
Graduated high school, Appleton High School, and then went to Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, and then went to Luther Seminary in St. Paul.
What did you study at Concordia then?
At Concordia, I had a history, political science major and an English minor.
And then you went to seminary?
Went to the seminary in St. Paul, yeah.
What led you to go into the seminary? How did
Well, it was a number of things. The loss of my brother in the Korean War was a part of it, and I've always been, as a young person, I had been thinking about it some, and I would laugh it off and say that's impossible. There's no way you can be a pastor and that sort of thing. But I was just sort of led down the road. There was no lightning striking or anything, but I ended up finally registering for Greek. And when you register for Greek at college, you're going to the seminary.
Okay.
That's the only reason for taking Greek. Yeah.
Okay. Related to
translating the New Testament from the Greek. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Did you grow up? Was your family religious, Lutheran? Was it?
We were Lutheran. We went to church most every Sunday except the third Sunday of the month because the service was in Norwegian and we didn't have to go then. I always look forward to the third Sunday of the month. But yes, we grew up in the church and very much involved in the life of the church. Yeah.
Is Dahlstrom, is that Norwegian then?
Dahlstrom is Swedish. It actually means valley stream in Sweden.
Okay. So you went to seminary, and were you married then, or when did you?
We were actually, Connie and I were married our senior year in college. I had been in the Army. I was with the Minnesota National Guard, and we were activated in '51. So I spent 22 months on active duty and came back to college. And then a couple years later, Connie and I were married. So we were married at the seminary also, yeah.
Where was your active duty served?
I was down at, then it was down in Alabama, Camp not Ripley, but Rucker, which is now Fort Rucker, the main Army helicopter station. But we reopened Camp Rucker following the Second World War. We came down there to an empty camp, and the Minnesota National Guard was moved down there, the 47th Infantry Division, and then we were filled with draftees and enlistees and went through basic and then became a division that sent people to Korea, but not as units, but as individuals.
Okay.
Yeah.
So after all that, did you get a posting at a church somewhere then, or how?
After I graduated from the seminary, I had what we call a call, posting in a church to Salem and Spencer, South Dakota.
Okay.
I had interned in Yankton. That's a one-year internship, your third year at the seminary. And so I was in South Dakota, and the bishop, or then it was called district president, knew me, and then so they offered me a call. I went to Salem and Spencer for 5 years. And then we came to Rapid City, where I served Calvary Lutheran Church for 30 years, and then I retired.
Salem and Spencer, two churches there? One
Two
in each
churches,
town?
yeah, both in, the Spencer Church was destroyed in the tornado that wiped that city out.
In the
Yeah.
90s?
Yeah.
Wow, okay. You said your undergraduate, you said, was it history and political science?
Yes. Yeah.
So you had an interest in politics then?
Well, no, I really didn't, and I wasn't really into politics that much. And in fact, much of what my time with Governor Kneip was not the political part of it, but the more personal part of it. I guess I became enthralled with history, and I was told that the political science would accompany that. If you want to be a teacher, you had both fields then that you could be teaching in. So I wasn't ever ambitious to be a politician, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you got to Salem though, what year was that?
1959.
Okay, and was Dick Kneip, was he living there when you got there, and what do you recall about meeting him?
Well, Dick and Nancy and a couple of their boys were living across the street from the parsonage. And they quickly became our family friends because our children were the same as their children. And we lived there for 5 years, and they were our neighbor for 5 years. In fact, there was a period of time there where I couldn't afford to buy my own lawnmower, so I would use Dick's lawnmower, and he always was very gracious to let me take his lawnmower and mow my lawn, and we'd go back and forth like that. Our kids played back and forth. They grew up together. Of all the different families I know the Kneip boys' names the best: Kevin, Kent, Keith, Kurt, Paul, Philip, Pat, Mike. Because they would be in our kids' prayers at night, God bless, and then you'd say, and then after a while you'd add another one and another one. In the 5 years we were there, we had 3 children, and I think Dick and Nancy had 3 or 4 or 5. So it was a very fruitful little corner of Salem, and our families kind of grew up together. And that's how I knew Dick and Nancy and their family, yeah.
Do you recall when you first met him, what was his involvement in politics? Was he a state legislator at the time?
No, at the time I first met him, he was a De La Belle area representative. He spent a lot of time down on farms and in rural areas, and the Mennonite center where he served all their needs for their milking cattle and their milking machines and stuff like that. And he went into politics. I'm a little bit rusty on, but I'm pretty sure it was through a process of a group that he had he was Catholic, and the Catholic Church in Salem was a very strong and very upgoing, and I had a good relationship with the priest, and we were good friends, and Dick, in a discussion at the church, Dick finally decided to run into politics. Not to mix church and religion, but that he was someone who could probably serve in that way. And so it did have a religious base to it, his motivation to go into politics. And it was sometime in the middle of those years that he went into the legislature, yeah.
What was he, when you first met him, what do you remember? What was he like? What kind of guy was he? What were your impressions? What do you remember about him from those early years when you first knew him?
Well, he was a people person. He was a person that you couldn't help but like. He was outgoing. The statue of him is a perfect example of, coat over his shoulder and putting his hand out to greet people. He was an easy friend to have. He was sensitive. He knew I was a Lutheran pastor, so he even asked me one time, Pastor or Larry. He would call me Larry, and he would say, "Now, when we have you over for dinner, is it embarrassing for you if I serve wine?" Didn't know if I drank or not. Drank a little, And he was very sensitive to things like that, and a very polite person, a hard worker, a go-getter, always a smile on his face, a fun person to be with, easy to be with. Yeah.
You mentioned his profession. He sold equipment for dairies, right?
Yeah, De La Belle.
Okay.
De La Belle.
That was the company name?
That was the company name. It was the milking machines back in the day when they were just coming into being in a big way. And he had the contract with the Mennonite colony, and that was a big one. And he would have them over to his home once in a while to serve them and talk with them. And that was always a fun time to watch, because they brought their wives along, and the wives would just love to watch TV because they didn't have TV down in their colony.
His life as a salesman, when you look back on that now, I would imagine that he probably learned a lot there that helped him in politics.
Sure, but he was just a natural. He was just a natural. I mean, yes, he learned, I'm sure, how to, but he just knew how to meet people and how to give them a sense of, I care about you. I want to be your friend. You know, he just had that ability. Yeah.
As far as his profession, you know, I've heard that he was a pretty successful salesman, but he had quite a large family, obviously. So do you remember that? I mean, were they well off? Were they middle class? Or how would you?
They were, I would say, definitely middle class. He was successful. He did well, and he provided well for his family. And like I say, he had a lawnmower that I used, and he had nicer cars always. And of course, his dad was in the car business too, so he had, you know, he had some connections there. But still, yeah, he was a hard worker, and he would have gone far in had he stayed with De La Valle or any other work that he did, because he's a very aggressive person. He couldn't sit still very long. He was on the move all the time. Yeah.
You know, Catholics haven't always been treated, you know, that well in this country's history. The 50s was, you know, prior to our first Catholic president. There's still, I'm sure, some prejudice. Was any of that present that you remember in Salem? Did he ever encounter that?
Not that I'm aware of, no. We had Salem was a smaller community, of course, and right next to Dick and Nancy was Don and Donna Kinsley, the local funeral director and ambulance driver and Methodist. And we three families became quite well associated and back and forth and everything. And on Christmas, we three families, the adults and the children that were old enough, would go Christmas caroling. And we'd go to the Catholic priest and Christmas carol for him. And he just got the biggest chuckle out of the fact that here's one of my Catholic members, a Lutheran pastor, and a Methodist, and they're all together Christmas caroling. That was the beginning of the ecumenical movement. And so I didn't sense any negative as far as his being Catholic, no.
Do you recall anything about him getting into politics when you two were together socially? Did he ever talk about, you know, why he wanted to do it, or in fact he was going to do it, or what his goals were, or anything? Do you remember? Do you recall any discussions with him?
No, I don't recall having many discussions with him about that. I was supportive of his running and his entering into politics, but I don't remember any deep conversations that we had. No.
What do you remember? You know, obviously the 50s, the 60s, Republicans had pretty much controlled everything there was to control in South Dakota. What do you remember? You know, I guess heading into the 70s, and you know, Dick Kneip would become governor, and Democrats would make a lot of gains. But in the 50s and 60s, would anybody have ever thought that would be possible? The extent to which Democrats made so many gains in the 70s?
I think that was a relatively big surprise. I don't recall any specific conversations about it. I know we did have one Democratic person in the House of Representatives. We did have one senator who was Democrat, so it was kind of like this solid Republican state was recognizing we need to have a little bit of balance there. And it seemed like it was a little bit more open understanding between the parties than you see today. There was more willingness to kind of work together. I look back over it and I often wonder, how did we have a Democratic senator for so long? McGovern, yeah. And then Johnson after him. Yeah. And Daschle. And you know, and so there was a little more of a understanding that Democrats are human beings too, and maybe have a little bit of a role, but not a very big role in South Dakota.
Suffice it to say, when you first got to Salem, the guy living across the street from you, who was selling dairy equipment, if you'd have said then he was going to be governor someday, that would have been kind of a long shot.
Oh, it would have been a long shot. Yeah, I never would have guessed that. No. How long were you in Salem then? 5 years.
5 years?
5 years, yeah.
Okay, and so when you left, where was he at in his political life?
He was still in Salem, and he was in the Senate. And,
States,
I don't know at what point he decided to run for governor. I never was a part of any conversation with that. In fact, as I was thinking back in terms of this interview and this time, I was not involved a lot in the political side of Dick Kneip, even when he was governor. I was more involved in the side of being his friend and being with him and helping where I can, but I wasn't politically involved in much of any way.
But from Salem, you came out here to Rapid
Came
City.
out to Rapid City, and we of course kept in contact, but then all of a sudden I heard he was running for governor.
Okay, and the church you served out here was Calvary?
Calvary Lutheran. It was located on Cottonwood and Evergreen down in the Canyon Lake area.
Okay.
Yeah, that's now a Southern Baptist church.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't even remember much about the time in reviewing some of there was an article in the State Historical Society's journal several years ago about the 70s and politics, and Republican Governor Frank Farrar had apparently tried to set up a government body that would regulate rural electric cooperatives in the way that the PUC regulates investor-owned utilities. And apparently that was very unpopular with farmers and rural people. And it was said that kind of opened the door maybe a little bit for a Democrat like Kneip. Do you remember anything about that, or remember why maybe Governor Farrar was kind of compromised or kind of ripe for the picking for a Democratic candidate?
Yeah, I don't remember specifically why he did that or what that was, but I do remember hearing that he was defeatable. And that sounds strange. A incumbent running, and he's had his 2 years, and he'd been a strong in the government before that as Attorney General. But I'd heard he is defeatable, and he had done something, and I wasn't completely clear what it was, but that he had stirred the people up. But the other side of that coin is, I think Dick Kneip ran a very unique campaign. Yes, he used the public media as much as he could and all of that. He had a catchy theme, what's a Kneip? And I don't know, it certainly isn't 100% true, but to a large extent, he walked the main street of every town in South Dakota. He shook the people's hands. He told them, I'm Dick Kneip, I'm running for governor, I'd like your vote. He used his personal touch, and I think that was a strong part of why he came through as strong as he did and won the election. He had a way about that, shortly after he was elected governor, he was out here and he was just trying to have a quiet weekend and get away from everything, and Connie and Nancy and Dick and I went out to get a bite to eat Sunday night. Went to a restaurant where it was quiet, and we're sitting there. And Dick surprised me. He said to the waiter, he says, you know who I am? And the waiter said, no. He says, I'm Governor Kneip. Oh, you're not. Yes, I am. And the waiter went back in the kitchen, came back out with our order, and he says, the guys in the kitchen say you're okay. And I think that's why Dick won. The guys in the kitchen, the farms, the common people, got a sense of this person is okay. And I think that was a big part of, and then there's the other political issues, and I think the Republicans were unhappy with Farrar over, and I'm sure it probably was, but over that very issue you mentioned. Yeah.
But he connected with regular people,
Yep.
and he felt like he was
Yep.
one of
He
them.
was a people person. Yeah.
Huh. I should back up a little bit. You personally, if you don't mind sharing, I mean, at that time and throughout your life, were you registered Republican?
I'm a registered
Independent?
Republican. I still am, and I wish I could have my Republican Party back again. But no, I'm a 3-generation Republican. In fact, people were surprised when I was appointed to the Board of Charities and Corrections by Dick Kneip. They thought I was a Democrat, and I was appointed after the flood of '72. Jerry Smith was killed in the flood, and he was on the board. And so Dick asked me if I would serve, and I took a look at it, and I thought it fit into my interests and my awareness and my work with people and all of that, so I said yes. And I served on it for 8 years. And it was a tremendously enlightening experience. The Board of Charities and Corrections was one of the two constitutional boards. There's only one left now, and that's the Board of Regents. It was eliminated under Governor Janklow, and the institutions of helping people with problems. Back then you call it handicapped. The Redfield, Custer State Hospital, the Old Soldiers Home, and then the penitentiaries. They're all within the state organization now. But back then, the Board of Charities and Corrections had the responsibility of the operation of those institutions, and it was outside of the cabinet part of the government.
So it was kind of an oversight board. Did the people who ran the facility at Redfield and the penitentiary and stuff report kind of to the board?
Report to us. We hired him, we fired him, and we did both. We had one we hired and had to fire quite quickly because he wasn't handling Redfield right. We set down the priorities. We met monthly at each of the institutions twice a year, and then in the state the other times. So we were on the institution's grounds twice a year, and kept our fingers on it. But we were not an operational board. We were a board of directors that set the direction and hired the people who could do the job.
Were there requirements at the time that there had to be so many Republicans and Democrats or whatever?
There was a requirement. There had to be one doctor and one attorney on a 5-member board. And when I was on it, there were 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so Governor Kneip appoints you, a Republican, to the board. Was that common for him? Did he, you would think usually a Democratic governor, everybody he appoints would be a Democrat. But
yeah.
Did he make a lot of?
I'm not aware. I don't know for sure. I assume he appointed me because he knew me well, and he knew the job. And the interesting thing also about Governor Kneip in terms of appointments and then trusting the people he's appointed. The Board of Charities and Corrections were meeting in Pierre one time, and he came to the board and he said, "I'd like to have you consider closing the institution at Plankington." And he gave us his reasons why, and I don't remember specifically what they were, but they were not just off the wall. There were some reasons for, and we had been looking at that institution. It was called a reformatory then. It was for children, youth, and we went to the institution purposefully to study it more and look at it, and we had different things that we did, and took a couple 3 months to study it. I forget how long it was, but we came back to Governor Kneip and we said no. Don't close Plankington. He never fought us on it. He never resented us for it. He never said, "I appointed 3 of you. I expected you to go along with me." He heard us out and he said, "Okay, we'll stay with it." He trusted the people he appointed.
What were some of the other? Do you remember any of the other a couple of big issues you guys dealt with while you were on that board?
Well, one of the big issues was finding a new warden for the penitentiary, because as we were interviewing candidates for it, there were some that came from Chicago and various big cities, and it was kind of like they wanted to put machine guns up on the walls, and it was very, very strict and very, very harsh, and not what we wanted in terms of a penitentiary. And then along came Herm Solem, who was working in the penitentiary, a retired Air Force pilot, colonel, Vice President Johnson's pilot, and he was working in the school in the penitentiary, and we selected him as our warden, and that was a big change and a big good positive thing for the penitentiary. Yeah.
So Governor Kneip, appoints you a pastor to this board, and Governor Kneip was Catholic, as you mentioned. What do you recall about, personally, professionally, and in politics, the role that his faith and his religion, played in his personal and professional life?
He was very respectful of clergy. Whenever he would give a speech, he would say, you know, in his introductions, he would include honored clergy. He was a very respectful person who had been taught that you respect your priest and you respect those people that are walking in that role in life. I never saw any sign of his using his religion to manipulate his politics. I think it was a part of who he was and how he dealt with people, but it wasn't, because I'm Catholic, you have to do this. Never saw anything like that at all, no.
Okay.
No.
Do you think it informed his policy decisions, his interests, you know?
I think it gave him a sense of compassion, a sense of caring for people, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Of course, he was governor during the flood out here,
Yes.
correct, in '72?
Yeah.
And I'm sure he came out here. What do you recall about that, about him visiting during the flood and how that affected him in his time as governor?
The morning of the flood, I flew off to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri to put in my 2 weeks with the Army Reserve. And Friday night, I was at the Officers Club. I was with the advance party of our division. It was the Wisconsin Reserve Division, the 84th. And I'd heard there was some flood going on in South Dakota. And the next morning, people at breakfast were saying to me, "Hey, Chappie, I hear that they really had a bad flood out your way." And so I tried to call my wife, and of course I couldn't get through. And I didn't know what was going on then. And finally, I got a phone call. And it was my wife telling me that she and the 5 kids were okay, and we were right close to the creek. And she had been looking for a place to make that phone call and couldn't find any place. And she wandered into National Guard headquarters because she knew that I was in the Guard and I was in the military, and she was trying to find somebody there who would help her get word to me that this flood had gone right through my parish area, and I had lots of people involved. And so she wanted me to have, not only for personal reasons, but for professional reasons. And as she was standing there, and the place was a zoo, everybody was trying to get things organized, and nobody would pay attention to this woman standing there, this young woman just trying to find someone where she can get a telephone. Out of the office walks Dick Kneip, Governor Kneip. He says, "Connie, what are you doing here?" And she says, "I've got to let Larry know that this has happened." He says, "Well, where is he?" He's down at Leonard Wood, Missouri. Within 5 minutes, my commander had a phone call from the governor of South Dakota. And within an hour, I was on a private Army plane to take me to St. Louis, and I flew home, and I was home at 10 o'clock that night.
Wow.
That was Saturday, because of Dick Kneip's call. And it just happened to connect.
Yeah.
Talk about the coincidences
Yeah.
of the, now.
Do you recall, did you see him at all when he was surveying the damage then, or when he was coming back?
I stayed away from him, and we didn't have any contact. I didn't see him at all until much later. He was busy doing his thing. I immediately I spent the week here, a time at all the funeral homes, mostly Ozzie Katrin Funeral Home, helping people identify the dead, and walking with the people. And I'd go visit members of mine whose homes had been destroyed. And then the second week, I went back to my duty at Fort Leonard Wood, finished out my week, and the commanding general, I gave him a report of the flood, and he ended up having a basket at pay call, and brought back a pretty good contribution to the flood from the 84th Division out of Wisconsin. So my second week, I was down there, but I was here for the week, and I didn't see Dick at all, no. We didn't cross paths till later when we talked about it. Yeah.
During his governorship, obviously he was the first Democratic governor since the 30s. How would you characterize the way that people in South Dakota viewed him, during his governorship, and did it change at all from start to finish, or how was he accepted? How was he viewed by people in South Dakota, as you recall, while he was governor?
Well, I was very careful to not mix politics and religion in terms of my congregation. I think he was well accepted. I know there was one Sunday where Dick and Nancy were in church, and I wrestled within myself. Do I introduce them? And I always wanted to protect Dick a little bit from always having to be governor. He's still just a human being. And so I chose not to introduce him, not to offend any of my members either, who were good, solid Republicans and didn't like him, whatever, you know. And they just quietly sat there and were a part of the service. I think the people learned to trust him. I know the National Guard, they came to me and they said, you know Dick Kneip, this is when he was running. And I said, yeah. I said, they said, well we like him, but we're concerned that he might appoint his brother to be Attorney General. You know, that can become a very political thing at times. And it's dangerous when it becomes that. And I said, I'll talk with Dick about that. And I did, and Dick said, there's no way I would do something like that. I'm not going to play that kind of game. And I told them, and I think that resolved them. But I didn't sense any great dislike of him. I think I sensed rather a sort of a surprise at how good a governor he was. And that this Democrat seems to be able to do the job too.
So not only does he become governor in the 70s, in 72, there was a 35-35 tie, Democrats and Republicans in the state house. Democrats had a 18-17 majority in the state Senate. Jim Aberesk is elected to Congress. A lot of successes. It's a broad question, but when you look back at all of that, how do you explain it? Like the rise of Democrats in that era?
I do not have an answer for that. No, it's almost a fluke of politics, and why they've disintegrated to the minority that they are today is bewildering and disappointing, because a government like that, where it's more balanced, is a healthier government. Yeah. But I don't know why. No.
Eventually, Governor Kneip, he tried to pass an income tax and almost did. Do you recall that? Was that unpopular? Was that part of? I don't know. Was that unpopular in South Dakota?
Yes. Income tax is unpopular in South Dakota, and there's reasons for it. And it wasn't popular then. He was popular for getting rid of the personal property tax. They call it, what do they call it? The liar's tax or something? Because people had golf carts, and they paid less personal property tax than I did when I reported everything I had, which was not very much. And it was in the paper, and then there was an article that came out and said, "We'll give you 2 weeks to get the proper reporting of your personal items and paying tax on it, or we're going to come down on you." And then shortly after that, Dick got rid of it, and everybody was really happy it was gone. And it probably was a liar's tax. Yeah.
Okay. What other accomplishments of his or mistakes stand out to you from his time as governor, if you recall anything?
No, I didn't get involved in a lot of the inner workings of his administration. The Board of Charities and Corrections was the most non-political board you could have in a political system. We worked out resolutions until the whole board could agree this is the best way to go for this institution. So I didn't get involved in politics that much. And I know there were problems along the way and things that were happening, but I guess between the Board of Charities and Corrections and being in the National Guard by that time and my parish, I didn't have time to be thinking about those things, and I just let them go by.
Governor Kneip, in his last term, he ends up leaving to become ambassador to Singapore.
Yeah.
Which not being around at the time, or being able to have a personal memory of it, I've always been curious about that, because it's so hard to become governor as a Democrat in South Dakota. I'm somewhat surprised that anybody would give up any time, and perhaps he's on his way out, whatever. But was that surprising? And do you remember anything at all about why or what the conversation was around that when he did that?
I remember it was surprising, and I think for Dick it was the chance, his eagerness to see more and do more and be more involved. And he only had a few months, less than a year left in his administration. And I think I never talked with him about it specifically, but I think he just chose to enlarge his involvement and his political career, if you want to put it that way. and going into now a federal kind of an appointment, and a chance to show his kids the world, I guess. Yeah.
He ended up dying relatively young.
Yes.
What do you remember about the circumstances around his death? And his
I know
passing?
it was cancer, and it went relatively fast, and they were living in Sioux Falls, and we had some contact with them periodically during that period. We were surprised that it went as fast as it went. I know that he was, Nancy had gone to some meeting or something when he went in the hospital and was severe, and I don't remember all the details, but I do remember his funeral, and I was able to be one of the pallbearers at his funeral.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you remember about that? What kind of about the funeral?
Funeral?
It
was a large funeral. It was at the, not at the cathedral, but at a Catholic church in Sioux Falls. And the bishop was there, the Monsignor, and the pastor of First Lutheran was also a pallbearer. And it came time for communion, and of course there's always the question of open communion was starting to be observed, but not so much on the Catholic side. And we were sitting in the front row, and he leaned over to me and he says, "You going to take communion?" The bishop is the one that's, and I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "I am too." And we went up, and the bishop didn't hesitate to give us communion. It was like, I'm not going to let any rules block out the sense of presence of the loving God. And the church was full. It was a powerful service. His oldest son, Kevin, I believe, was the one, and Mike and one of the younger sons stood by him to help him give their part of an address in honor of their dad, and it was a very powerful service.
When you look back, as you mentioned, Democrats in South Dakota today are much diminished, in a much diminished place. They don't have any statewide office, extreme minority in the legislature. Is there anything, when you look back at the success Democrats were able to have in the 70s, Dick Kneip and others, that would translate to anybody in the Democratic Party today, wanting to learn something from that era to try to gain some traction now or in the future?
I really don't know. They need someone like a Dick Kneip, someone who has that kind of energy and that kind of charisma, and was able to excite the people to take another look in a different direction. And right now, it's I have been debating re-registering as independent, and one of the reasons I don't do it is because in the primary, I might be able to help select the most safe that I feel per person that's running for an office, and try to keep our Republican side a little bit more balanced than too extreme. So we've stayed Republican, and maybe it's just the easy way out too. I'd like to see the Republican Party become the Republican Party of George McGovern and Bob Dole.
What do you think Dick Kneip would say about our politics today if he was still alive?
I think he would be shaking his head, and he would be out there talking with people and shaking their hands and telling them, "Hey, take another look at this. You're barking up the wrong tree." Yeah.
As far as just the tone and
the tone of it and everything. Yes.
Yeah.
It's gotten to the point of ridiculous. Yep.
We'll take just a minute break here and see if there's anything from the other notes they gave me that they wanted me to cover with you. Do you need a drink of water or anything while we're...
I'll have-
Go ahead. I guess a couple questions similar to what we just talked about is, for those of us who weren't around to know what the political climate was in the 70s, how do you compare and contrast it to today? I mean, obviously there was Watergate, and there was, you know, the end of Vietnam, and there was division, but how would you contrast just the political climate of then to today?
Well, I think that the thing that comes to my mind, first of all, is that there was willingness to work together, even with all the extremes and all of the issues and the things that were happening. There was a willingness to finally sit down and work together. And I just haven't seen that lately. It's just like they're not even willing to consider the other side. A good friend of mine, who's a very solid Republican, just would not believe as a Democrat could be an honest person. And I see too much of that today.
But in the 70s, obviously, you think people were more willing to...
I think they were more willing, yeah, more willing to recognize that. And Daschle was respected. Or who was our senator in the 70s? Was that still McGovern?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was respected and looked to as, you know, a human being worth trusting, kind of a thing. Yeah.
So Dick Kneip, who came along today and was running, do you think he'd have a shot?
I think he would. Yes,
Yeah.
I think he would. Let me tell you a story about Dick Kneip that, that again, his way with just having to be with people. I was always concerned about Dick being consumed by the job, and he had 8 boys, and a wife, and a home, and a family. I mean, and he's not going to be governor forever, but he's going to be a husband and a father forever. And so I checked with his office, and got his calendar cleared for a Saturday, and it happened to be the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend. And I said, put it down, he's going fishing.
Okay.
And he had the boat, and we got his boat, and I had one of my sons with me, and a couple of 2 or 3 of his boys were old enough to go fishing. And I hadn't done any fishing over at Pier at all, so I didn't know where to go. You know, now I would know, because I've been doing a lot of fishing over there in the years, but I didn't then. So we put in below the dam, and we're trolling along where the campgrounds are there and all of that area there. And for about an hour, and Dick is okay with it and everything, all of a sudden he says, Larry, put me on shore. Well, I put him on shore, and he starts greeting all the campers who are there for Memorial Day weekend. Here's the governor of South Dakota greeting them as they're camped in their capital city. That's the energy he had that I think would win another election. Just to get out there and be with them and shake their hand and say, I'm Dick Kneip, I'll represent you, and I'll be fair. You know, and he conveyed that kind of a sense. He wasn't perfect, of course not, but he did convey that kind of a positive attitude.
Apparently he drew energy from just being around people.
Yep, yep.
That's a great story. I'm glad you added that. Is there anything we haven't covered that you think we ought to about?
One other time, my boys and I the 2 boys and I were fishing right below the dam by the highway that goes, by the bridge that goes across, right down in that area there. And it was about 7 o'clock at night, and we're out there fishing, and I heard my voice. I heard someone call, Larry! And I looked over, and here was Nancy and Dick. They were governor now. And so I pulled the boat over to the shore, and here's the governor of South Dakota bringing us cookies and coffee at 7 o'clock at night. It was one of those feelings, and he's my friend first before he was governor, so I know that was there. But still, they took that kind of effort to come and greet us. And again, that's the energy that I see in both Nancy and Dick. And Nancy was a great partner, and she had many things going within her arena as First Lady, and did many wonderful things too.
Do you remember with such a large family, do you remember much about what their family life was like, you know, while he was governor?
Well, it was hectic at times. Our kids stayed there a number of times with them, and they had a lot of.
Governors mentioned.
Yeah, and they had a lot of. In fact, two of our children went there after the flood and stayed there for a few days before they came back, because our house was partially damaged. Yeah, and our kids always, if you ask our kids about it today, the first thing they would say was they had a milk machine. They had so many kids, they got a milk machine rather than buying by the gallon, you know. And our kids just loved that. Like you're at a cafe, you can go and get your milk. And their personal life was okay in the mansion. The public part of the mansion was separate, but they had their personal life, and I think they got along. Our kids, they went there and enjoyed being there with them, and they had a good time. Yeah.
And what kind of things were the Kneips involved in as a family then?
Well, they were not involved in a lot of things, except, and of course, the kids were in sports. And in peer, I'm sure they were involved in their church and in sports and things like that. And they went on to a variety of careers themselves. They've are all very successful, and I think most of them graduated from South Dakota State, if I remember right. In fact, I think Dick bought a house there, rather than the kids could just keep staying in that house, and they handled it that way. Yeah.
Okay, that's a great story too. Anything else we didn't cover?
Well, I think, Dick and I never had any real arguments. Now, but we didn't sit and talk politics, and we as I thought about this interview and everything, I suddenly realized I really wasn't politically aware. I was aware of the role of my friend in this office and the importance of it and the honor of it and the challenge of it, but I didn't get really into the details, except that one with the Board of Charities and Corrections when we told him no and he said okay. And I realized that I guess I was busy in my parish life, and I had the military, and I had the Board of Charities and Corrections, which was a very exciting 8 years for me. There was a 5-member board running the major institutions of the state, and it was the most responsible board I've ever been on.
Do you think he had a lot of relationships like that, and was that part of his success, that he was able to have people see him as a person first and a Democrat?
I think so. I definitely think so. Yeah. I think in some ways Dick was surprised to be elected, and he never forgot that it was a gift. Yeah, and he worked hard to give the gift back in the way he conducted himself. Yeah.
Okay. I think that's all the questions I had for you.
Okay. All right.
Anything else you want to add? Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's it.
Good.
Thank
Great.
you very much.
All right.
It's really interesting.